So in this final lesson talking about the institutions of the European Union, what we're going to do is focus on the European Court of Justice, which makes sense. We're studying EU law. The Court of Justice is one of the most important institutions of the European Union for the legal implications and the legal principles that it hands down. Just like with all of the other lessons that we have done where we've examined the various different institutions of the European Union, we'll talk about the Court of Justice in terms of what the treaties say about the Court of Justice, the Treaty on European Union, for example, talk about the various different competences that the Court of Justice has, as well as the powers and authority, the structure of the court, and the way in which the court operates. As you can probably imagine, as I've mentioned as well at the start of this lesson, the European Court of Justice is one of the most important institutions for anybody who is studying European Union law. When we study European Union law, one of the major elements of EU law is the cases that is handed down by the Court of Justice of the European Union. So we'll get to those in future lessons' time, but for now, in terms of examining and highlighting the importance of various institutions, the Court of Justice for a law student is one of the most important. So, the Court of Justice of the European Union is sometimes described as the Court of Justice of the European Union, and is the ECJ-EU, and is made up of a number of judicial institutions. Okay, so the Court of Justice of the European Union is a little bit more of a multifaceted judicial institution. There is the Court of Justice itself, the ECJ, okay, and then you also have the General Court, because of course there are multiple different institutions of, or at least of judicial institutions. Because there are multiple instances of judicial institutions, though, this does not suggest that this is an appeals court. The Court of Justice of the European Union is not an appeals court. So where we look at domestic legal systems, like in England and Wales, for example, you see that there are various different appeals courts that take place. You have the Court of Appeal, and then you have the Supreme Court at the highest level. The Court of Justice of the European Union is not that. It means that cases are heard in other jurisdictions will not be able to just simply appeal to the ECJ if the ruling is not in their favour. Instead, like judicial decisions in domestic courts, the Court of Justice of the European Union is a first instance court. Okay, so you will go to the European Court of Justice to uphold the law of the European Union. It will hear cases which are brought specifically and directly to them, so with the intention to bring it to them, not as a final last resort or an appeal from previous judicial decisions. Most of the time, however, the Court of Justice of the European Union has cases brought to it by other institutions of the European Union. So, for example, and as we've mentioned in previous lessons, the guardians of European Union law, the European Commission, will often bring cases and litigation against member states to the European Court of Justice. This is why, if you were to open your textbook of EU law, say you've got Craig and Burca, for example, and you look in on the front pages where you have a table of cases and it lists all the cases that are discussed in that textbook, you will see that a lot of them are the Commission versus a particular member state. And that is the reason for that is because the Commission often brings cases to the European Court of Justice against often member states. In terms of the structure of the court, there are 27 judges who will sit on the European Court of Justice. These will be supported by the work of 11 advocates general. So they are essentially bolstered by further advocate generals who will support the judges in the work of the court itself. Now, the general structure and role of judges is provided by and outlined by Article 19 of the Treaty on European Union. Article 19 says the following. It says that the Court of Justice of the European Union shall include the Court of Justice, the General Court, and specialist courts. So as I've mentioned, the Court of Justice of the European Union is almost the collective term for a number of individual courts which exist in and around the institutions of the EU. So the Court of Justice of the European Union refers to the Court of Justice, the General Court, and any other specialist courts which could also exist. And it shall ensure that in the interpretation and application of the treaties, the law is observed. Member states shall provide remedies sufficient to ensure effective legal protection in the fields covered by Union law. The Court of Justice shall consist of one judge from each member state. It shall be assisted by advocates general. The General Court shall include at least one judge per member state. So similarly, just like the Court of Justice, the General Court, which is also a part of the the Court of Justice of the European Union, shall also have at least one judge of a member state. The judges and advocates generals of the Court of Justice and the judges of the General Court shall be chosen from persons whose independence is beyond doubt, and who satisfy conditions set out in Articles 253 and 254 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. They shall be appointed by common accord of the governments of the Member States for 6 years. Retiring judges and advocates general may be reappointed. So this essentially is getting into the details of the appointments process for new judges to the courts of justice or the General Court. They would have to be independent, so there is a maintenance of judicial independence as essentially to be able to adhere to the rule of law. And then there are also provisions that are set out in the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, which give us the conditions that are required for a member, for an individual, to be appointed to the Court of Justice. They will be appointed by common accord of the governments of the member states for 6 years. So the terms in which judges actually sit are for 6 years, and then you may be reappointed if you are retiring after that period of 6 years, if you so wish, and the member state wishes you to do so. The Court of Justice of the European Union shall, in accordance with the treaties, rule on actions brought by a member state, an institution, or a natural or legal person. This gives us the jurisdiction of the court, at least the people who are allowed to and able to be heard by the court. So this is a court that will hear cases from a multitude of different individuals and institutions. It can be brought by a member state. A member state can go to the European Court of Justice. It can be brought by a European institution. Most often this is the Commission, or it can be by an individual person, a private individual, legal or natural person. The Court of Justice will also give preliminary rulings at the request of courts or tribunals of member states on the interpretation of EU law or the validity of acts adopted by the institutions. They will also rule in other cases provided by the treaties. So these are essentially the powers of the European Court of Justice. Now, because we're studying EU law and we're talking about the legal principles of the European Union, it is actually the case that we're going to be talking about these in more detail as we get to the substantive law itself. So in the next few lessons, we'll talk about EU competence, we'll talk about the lawmaking process, we'll talk about the sources of EU law, and we'll talk about the legislative process specifically. And then we will get into the ways in which the Court of Justice will uphold European Union law by and through things like preliminary rulings, before we then start to talk about the ways in which EU law is upheld in the domestic systems of the legal of the member states. So through principles such as direct effect and indirect effect, for example.